All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our event today. I hope you enjoyed this little exercise. We'll be hanging on to these thoughts, and I think we're going to use them at the end of our event today to talk a little bit about our concluding thoughts and reflect on the exercise that we've done here today. All right, a few things that we want to establish before we get started. I want to introduce myself as well. My name is Gabby Chu. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm currently a third year at the University of Virginia, and I'm here on behalf of the 1882 Foundation, where I've worked in and interned with for almost 2 years now. What you'll see on your screen is today's agenda. Our short welcome was that little activity that we just did. We'll be going through some brief accommodations that we have for today's session, do a quick land acknowledgement, and introduce our panelists before moving into the main meat of today's session. So first, I want to introduce some accommodations we have today. We have ASL interpretation provided by Jan and Catherine from TRJ Bridges. We have a graphic recorder today by Sarah Yukimoto Saltman. So she'll be drawing some thoughts that people have today as our conversation kind of flows to get a visual representation of what we've talked about here today. And lastly, we have session recording assistance by Jelani Bird on behalf of the Urban Studio. And of course, I will be doing the front end of this program as well as the audience Q&A at the end. So look forward to it. Another thing that I wanted to touch on before we get started with our session today is a land acknowledgement. So today's session is based on DC's Chinatown, and as much as Chinatown residents are immigrants who are subject to the greater tides and powers of global migration and white supremacy, we are not the original stewards of this land and must also acknowledge our complicity in their oppression and the appropriation of their land. Although we gather today from a virtual space, DC's Chinatown and the city overall is located on stolen land, the traditional stewards of which are the Piscataway people. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold their responsibilities according to their example. There's a resource link that you'll see here if you'd like to learn more about land acknowledgements in general and the stewards of traditional land. I'm going to hand it over to Jen now to start introducing the Dear Chinatown DC project and get us into our panelists today.
Great, thank you so much, Gabby, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Jen Lowe. I wear many hats, but one is tonight's Humanitini curator, and we'll be presenting a conversation that is connected to a project called Dear Chinatown DC. And first, I want to acknowledge I'm also a background in landscape architecture and urban design, and I am a deputy director at the 1882 Foundation and also a board member of the Urban Studio. So I would also like to acknowledge in this conversation all of the Chinatowns across the continent who are organizing and doing storytelling efforts as a means to make visible the histories and the social histories of Chinatown and why it's meaningful to its various communities. So next slide. So the conversation that we have today is sort of, I think, under the topics of gentrification and displacement as a result of gentrification. So as a working definition, gentrification is really about the process of how over time, lower income and under-resourced neighborhoods have an influx of investments, and that's in the form of capital and resources that come into a neighborhood that can fundamentally change and shape and create a different sort of visual of the neighborhood as a result of upper and middle class families, residents move in. One outcome of gentrification is displacement of working class communities in place. And as it pertains to this conversation around Chinatown, next slide. We're really talking about sort of also an alienation of place from residents, but also the alienation and cultural erasure of sort of social histories and the people that had the longtime community of DC's Chinatown in particular. Right now, DC is experiencing one of the highest rates of displacement as a result of gentrification through a study that was prepared by the University of Minnesota, looking at processes of gentrification between the years 2000 and 2016. And DC's Chinatown is particularly vulnerable at the city center. These are a couple of photos from some real estate blog posts of a couple of different hotel projects that have been in conversation. Next slide. And just to situate contextually about DC's Chinatown in particular, it hasn't always been in the same place. So sort of like early in the late 1800s, the Chinatown neighborhood was actually located closer to the capital. So further south, about 1.5 miles from where Chinatown is today, as indicated by the red rectangle. Next slide. And as a result of like a variety of different sort of processes between current events, immigration patterns, urban renewal, we've sort of gone from a place that has been a safe haven for immigrants, communities, as a place of belonging, to a place of increasing alienation and erasure of cultural heritage and history. Next slide. So what one project I wanted to highlight that will segue into this panel conversation today is Dear Chinatown, DC. This was a storytelling intervention pop-up that we introduced earlier this year during the Chinese Lunar New Year parade. So we had an activity, which was a poster making exercise where we created these kits. And the prompt was, what are the things about Chinatown that you love? And we placed this right in front of the Wallach House, which is a residential building in DC's Chinatown. Next slide. So we spent the day there, and we invited some community, some other partners in this work. So we had our Dear Chinatown poster making station, which was in collaboration with the 1882 Foundation and also the Humanities truck, and the Smithsonian Anacostia, A Right to the City exhibit. And we had a Mobilizing Memories interview station as well. So we spent the day in front of here where we had exhibits, opportunities to interview individuals who were so inclined to do so. We had conversations with residents from the Wallach House, which is one of the only remaining, one of two remaining affordable housing buildings in and near DC's Chinatown that actually house sort of the remaining senior residents in the neighborhood. And we invited many different sort of families and children, sort of like old and young, to make a poster about what they love about the neighborhood. Next slide. And so here's a couple of pictures of the exhibits of our interview station. Next slide. And we also had some oral histories on the Humanities truck that many of the people that are part of the parade committee and part of the festivities were able to point themselves out or point out their friends. Next slide. And so these are some of the posters that emerged from that conversation. We collected 84 posters that day, and a lot of the themes, next slide, centered belonging, a safe haven, family, and of course food. So a lot of these sentiments were very different from sort of larger sort of themes about Chinatown, from the sort of mainstream messaging of culture, of commercial and tourism centered interests, to a place that's really about family, about a neighborhood and a community. And so moving forward, that has been sort of a year-long effort to sort of look at this prototype and the capacity of unearthing storytelling as a key sort of tool as a resistance. So some other next steps that like naturally kind of filter and build on some work is, one, we're taking a lot of the information and insights gathered from the Dear Chinatown pop-up into a digital mapping project. So we're going to put these memories and stories to place to capture an image and a map about the neighborhood that you can't really find in a Google map. That will be launched at the end of this year. Our ongoing work is collecting oral histories too of the neighborhood, longtime like business owners, in particular in a project called Chinatown Off H Street Oral History Project with the 1882 Foundation and also Humanities DC through their community heritage grants. It's highlighting a Buddhist temple, the bright pink one you may have come across while you're in the neighborhood, the Chinatown Market, and also an acupuncture shop. So trying to capture the social histories and significance of these cultural spaces and their programming, to talk about a story about buildings that's about sort of the programs and activities as opposed to just the building itself. And lastly, I want to touch on sort of the larger stories to share about Asian American culture in Washington, DC. We're also embarking on, I'm also working in collaboration with the DC Preservation League and the 1882 Foundation on an 18-month project on the cultural context study for Washington, DC, where community stories will be really integral to telling the history about DC through the lens of Asian American identity. And next slide. So that's sort of like a little summary to contextualize today's conversation. And I'm so excited to be able to have here today some individuals who have been doing some incredible work as leaders of the DC's Chinatown community. We have Shirley Woo from the Chinatown Service Center, Jack Lee, who has been a longtime leadership in the Chinese Youth Club, and Ted Gong from the 1882 Foundation. So I will go ahead and we can turn off the slide deck, and then we can invite our panelists to turn on their cameras. And I would love for, hello Ted and Shirley and Jack to provide just a 2-minute introduction before we start our conversation. And I'll start with Shirley.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Thank you. Yes, my name is Shirley Woo. I was born and raised in DC, Washington, DC, actually. One of the few people who was actually born in DC. A lot of people come here for work, but my parents came a long time ago, and we had a laundry in Southeast Washington, DC, I guess past the US Capitol. And this is where I was brought up and raised. So we were always familiar with DC Chinatown. We would come here on weekends, especially to catch up with old friends, and we knew people who lived around here at that time. Okay, my work at the center, Chinatown Service Center, has been ongoing for at least over 20 years. My husband and I have been always involved with social service work. We were always interested and always involved in tutoring and teaching English to immigrants and citizenship classes. Okay, let's see. Most of the work in the Chinatown Service Center is with the Chinese immigrants in our neighborhood and also in the metropolitan area. And almost everyone that comes for our service don't speak very much English. They lack English proficiency. And that's why they need to come to ask for services. Most of the people that work here, they do live in subsidized housing like Wallach House and other places. They work as usually as cooks if they're men. They're waiters, they work in the kitchen, anything they can do. Ladies tend to be maids or they tend to be caretakers. Now, my only other involvement with another Chinatown would be the Manhattan Chinatown in New York. So growing up, we would have a one-day trip, only one day, because my family couldn't take off that much because of the laundry business to do that. So we would leave early in the morning before dawn, drive to New York just to buy Chinese groceries, because the Chinatown here didn't have that much to offer. Even though Chinatown is small now, even back then, I suppose it was even smaller and more quiet. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Ted, may I have you introduce yourself?
Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's really a privilege to be here, always with the good friends Jack and Shirley and everyone else. My name's Ted Gong, and I'm the Executive Director of the 1882 Foundation. And a little bit about that first. The foundation was formed almost like 12, 13 years ago. And what we were trying to do is to get Congress to apologize for the Chinese exclusion laws of 1882. So we were successful in doing that in 2011 and 2012. And afterwards, we formed an education program called the 1882 Foundation. Not very creative, but that idea was that it's not enough to simply highlight the fact that the exclusion laws occurred and people apologize for it. You have to have a continuous education effort. And the way we do that is through collection of oral histories and preservation of sites. We do education planning and curriculum development, and we do symposiums with museums and historical societies around the country to talk about best practices. My connection to Chinatown is that, well, first of all, I'm a foreign service officer, so I've really not had a long time living in the United States since I grew up, a 35-year career, mostly overseas. But Chinatown in DC has always been a connecting point for me because I've always come back to Washington. And when we settled here, then it's very logical for us to look into the histories and the issues that are happening illustrated in Chinatown. That's how I met these wonderful people like Shirley and Walter and Jack and a whole host of people. My other connections with Chinatown has been, I was raised in California, and I was raised in rural part of California. And just like Shirley, we were small, the only Chinese, or maybe of two families in our little rural town. Our rural town was in the middle of California agriculture area. And so then whenever we wanted to go get some good Chinese food or get Chinese groceries, we would head off to San Francisco or Los Angeles. And that's always been a connection for us. In the area we go in, we also have rural Chinatowns that are not as big or developed as those places in San Francisco, New York, or other places, even in Washington, DC. That connection has always been there. And one of the things that's drawn me to it is to try to understand the history of those places as well as my place and my connections to them.
Thanks, Ted. And Jack.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Jen, and to the whole group, and Ted for those kind words. I was born and raised in Washington, DC, and lived in Chinatown for probably the first 35 years of my life. It was a great area to grow up in, very safe, very social area for me. As a member of the Chinese Youth Club, that was one of the few organizations that had the interest of the local Chinese youth. There were no boys clubs in Chinatown. There was no Boy Scouts. Very few structure type organizations. So the Chinese youth provided me a place to increase my athletics and also to my culture. If you come down to the Chinatown every Chinese New Year's, and we're one of the oldest groups that perform the lion dance as part of our culture. You know, Chinatown will always be a home for me and always a place that I would cherish. And you know, I'm glad that we're having this opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Jack. And one of the posters featured earlier today is actually one of Jack's posters, so it's one of my favorites. So I'm going to start the conversation, and I'm going to actually direct it to Shirley first. Given your work with the Chinatown Service Center, can you speak to sort of how has things changed for you and your work, and also the work you do with your clients over the past sort of 30 or more years, I think, that you've been doing this?
Yes. I guess, well, I actually believe the language has changed. In the beginning, I think almost everyone spoke Toisanese or Cantonese. And now it's like very few people speak Cantonese or Toisanese. They speak Mandarin or from Fujian. And Fujian actually has a different language. I didn't know that until I realized that the Mandarin people couldn't understand the Fukienese people for some reason. It was different. I thought, oh, well, anyway, somehow we manage. So now we need to find more volunteers who speak Mandarin more than we need to find volunteers who speak Cantonese. So that's a big difference over the years. And now recently we know because of the gentrification, the development in Chinatown, it's becoming very, very difficult to live in Chinatown. Everything's more high end. We have expensive condominiums, expensive shopping. It's good and bad. It makes it cleaner. And maybe because of that, the city's more aware of making it more safer for people. So we don't have the homeless maybe milling around. They've sort of told them to move on. So, and that's good, but it makes it very difficult if you're a new immigrant who just arrived and you don't have much money and you don't have, you know, the language and where are you going to live? It's very hard to find affordable housing. That part, I think, is very sad. Now, I think, though, that as a rule, most Chinese immigrants, it's not their life goal to live here for the rest of their life. They really want their children to be educated, to go to college and become a professional, and they want to move on. And in that case, they will not be living in the city because, again, it's too expensive. They will probably live in Virginia or the Maryland suburbs. So I think that has changed too. And then I think also changing is that in the past, when I was growing up, we could have Chinese immigrants could have a business. So you could have a laundry, you could have a mom and pop shop, and you could make it as a living. Well, now new immigrants arrive, they don't go into business. Maybe it's not affordable, you can't find one to rent. So you tend to work for someone else, and you have to work extremely hard, 6 days a week. You don't really have time with your children. So a lot of kids are on their own, or if they're here even, a lot of the parents will send their kids back to China to be brought up until they're older to come. And I think that's different too. And maybe because not all the grandparents were able to come. So we don't have that maybe network of family that's not, that we used to have as before. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Shirley. And Jack, can you also kind of provide some background on when your family arrived in Chinatown and when you had sort of moved out of Chinatown as well?
Yeah, sure. My parents came to Chinatown together in 1948, but prior to that, my great-grandfather brought my father over probably around the early 1930s. The typical immigrant, pattern of bringing over a son, a paper son. My father would work for my great-grandfather. They had laundry business, mostly in the beginning. Then, he went back to marry my mother back in the late 30s and came back, but they got separated due to World War II. So, not until after the war could my father go back and bring my mother back. And of course, they came right before the whole communist revolution happened. So, I was then, with my brothers, we lived on 6th Street Northwest. But the thing was, we didn't go to school there. The schools were not close to Chinatown. I went to junior high school. It was in Southwest. I went to high school in Upper Georgetown, not because I was rich. That was the public boundary. And then on to college in the suburbs. So part of our pattern of life, at least with the education, was we didn't go to schools right in our neighborhood. Some of them were just too dangerous or felt it was too dangerous. And so we moved around. And then following my marriage, I moved out to Silver Spring. We had looked in the Washington area, but we just couldn't afford it. Even back then, we couldn't afford to where we wanted to live.
Thanks, Jack. And can you also let the audience know what were the locations in Chinatown that your family lived?
Yeah, I lived on the 700 block of 6th Street, so really next to the corner of 6th and 8th Street, which in my thinking was really the center of Chinatown. I know a lot of people think that the Arch is the center, but I think where we lived was the intersection of the restaurants and the residents.
Thank you, that's super helpful. I'm also going to have Ted talk a little bit. Well, actually, I'll have all of you speak to this, but I want to just segue into the role of telling stories and the process of telling stories. Ted, I'd like to have your thoughts on about why it's important to be able to tell these stories, especially about stories in Chinatown.
Sure. I just want to comment or talk on top of what a little bit, take a lead from Jack. Jack was saying that 6th and H is the real center of Chinatown. And actually, I totally agree with you. In fact, our whole project that Jen had talked about, which we call the Chinatown off H Street, is actually centered around those three buildings, those three businesses right there in the corner. That's the herbal and acupuncture shop. Then there is the temple, the big temple, the pink temple everybody marks. And then there's Chinatown Market. Chinatown Market's been there since there are photos of the place since 1930s. But what we want to do is highlight those places, tell the stories of those places, and then highlight them so that people can know that is important for the Chinatown community, in the sense that we're talking about what do you do in terms of faith? What is Chinatown faith? This Buddhist temple, that is an active temple. And if anybody has ever been to Hong Kong or Taiwan or the mainland, you will see that that temple looks exactly and operates exactly like a neighborhood temple would. The Chinatown Market, of course, is over there. And Jack, when you do your lion dancing, or even the older people in the CYC who do lion dancing, some of the most greatest challenges for the lion dancers would come from the shopkeepers there, making you jump on planks to do your thing to wish them good luck. The acupuncture shop and the herbal shop is one of the few remaining, actually, of traditional herbal medicine. And an acupuncture doctor who's been there for many, many years actually came in from Mongolia. So if you're talking about trying to keep the stories and maintain the place, regardless of whether we can keep the buildings, the stories are essential for us to tell that entire story of the Chinatown society, from how it keeps itself healthy to how it buys bok choy or little Chinese newspapers at the corner, or how they how they keep their faith. And that's an important thing of what we're doing. And what we're hoping is that maybe we can recenter or make people aware that the 6th and 8th Street is still very important, and recenter Chinatown into that area through the process of making people aware of the stories and then telling them and preserving them and telling them. And that's an essential part of storytelling from our perspective. From 1882 Foundation, we have something we call the monthly Talk Story series. And one of the things about that is that it is the process of coming together to tell and share our stories that our community is strengthened. So we often use that term, our community, the life of our community, regardless of whether you live there or not, you live in Springfield or not, if you can come together to share your stories and remember your stories and to share your stories, and that gives that community life. Is very much one of our sayings is that it's our stories, our community, our strength.
Thanks, Ted. And I'd like to also, Jack and Shirley, about sort of, I know you both have been interviewed and many times about your histories too, about the neighborhood. How has that changed what you sort of think about either your experiences or your relationship to Chinatown over time?
Well, what I always like to highlight, I wish I had taken, more pictures if I had a camera or, had a tape recorder to record, because I think Ted is doing a fantastic job. I always say that, my history of Chinatown starts with athletics, because my parents worked 2 and 3 jobs. So most of the time, in fact, every night my mother didn't get home till 2 a.m. So most of the time she didn't even know where I was, So, but without a boys club and things like that, we hung out on the streets until it was either, a volleyball or basketball season or softball, depending on the weather. What I wish Chinatown always had, and I tried to do this when I was an ANC representative, is there's no place for the kids to play. We played in the alleys and the parking lots. I advocated with the DC City Council to say, we just need a space. When I went to play basketball, I had to go all the way down to either Southwest or Upper Northwest to play. We just had to travel so far just to do a little bit. And there was always, some danger if you didn't travel in a group, because I like to walk everywhere. I hated riding the bus. So I have to walk through U Street. I had to walk through Northeast. And I just think that that is one of the things and legacies I wish that, I could have fulfilled for Chinatown.
I want to make another comment. Jack always raises these things when he talks about basketball or volleyball. I don't know how many people realize, I didn't realize this until I came to DC, how important CYC is, the China Youth Club of DC. And that was started, how many years ago, Jack? Maybe
1939.
1939. But what is important about it centers around the youth, and it's over these multiple years that have decades of changing generations. CYC does something called nine-man volleyball. Is basically guys that came together in the back, in the alleys after their restaurant work, and they would do what they have to do to relax by bouncing volleyballs, or actually these made-up volleyballs back and forth. Jack, you might want to talk about that, but I want to give you a context of it, is that 60 plus years, or more than 60 plus years, that volleyball has been played almost like a pickup basketball. It's like pickup basketball for Chinatowns. And it's not just DC Chinatown. It is Chinatowns in New York, San Francisco, Toronto, and other places. And every year they rotate and have this huge volleyball contest. The last time it rotated into DC is, what it was, 5 or 6 years ago.
2013.
2013. The number of people participating in that took over the entire Pennsylvania Avenue from almost close to the White House to the FBI building. That is how important that pickup volleyball that these guys used to do after the restaurant and between restaurant breaks. They used to play it at the corner that was where Wallach used to be. Wallach House is now in the corner, used to be an open lot. They used to play right on the street on H Street before the city decided it was too important a street to cut off. But in terms of maintaining a identity or a culture that reaches back, which is pure Chinese American, CYC and 9-man volleyball is so important. And maybe, Jack, you could talk about how significant it is to pass it down to generations. Involves your wife who's made these great films about it, that kind of thing.
Well, I think if anyone is interested, there was a movie made called 9-Man. 9-man volleyball is unique to the Chinese from Toisan, and now to most Chinese and Chinese Americans. It is an annual tournament played every. Actually, funny, it's on Labor Day, it got off, and so they would get together. So it started very small with New York, Boston, Providence, and then Washington joining later. I would just encourage them to see that and watch that movie. Unfortunately, this year, we were supposed to host a tournament, but because of the pandemic, we had to cancel everything. So maybe next year, if things go better, we may reconsider hosting it. But it is a very bonding social thing. I love going to it. I love being part of it. Families and friends, just, it expands your horizons to the other Chinatowns and folks from the other Chinatowns.
That's great, Jack. The pictures of 9-man volleyball are really cool to see, that are circulating around. Actually, speaking of intergenerational spaces, Shirley, I wanted you to also, can you speak about actually the Chinese Community Church and its history? Because it actually has a really long-standing fixture in the neighborhood.
Oh, that's true. The Chinese Community Church likes to say it's the only Chinese community church in Washington, D.C., which is true. This year, we would have celebrated 90 years. But because of the pandemic, there's no big celebration as in the past. So it's been around a long time. And because it's been around a long time, it's familiar with the neighborhood, with the immigrants that come to live in DC. And this would be the first place you would stop to get help. So you would say, oh, I need help. I need someone to read a form for me. Where can I apply for healthcare? Where can I enroll my kids in school? And that was the reason the center was started, so we could have weekday services. So a lot of the people that do come to church do live in the community, like at Wallach House, and they live in the surrounding apartments. But again, like everybody, a lot of us have moved away. Like I live in the suburbs, and a lot have moved into Montgomery County. That could be the other, I know you would call it a Chinatown, but all the better Chinese restaurants tend to be out in Montgomery County, the bigger grocery stores, and this is where you would go shopping. And unfortunately, DC does lack the better Chinese food. People would say, oh no, it's really just for tourists to eat there. But there are a few places that are still trying their best. I always think of China Boy, where you can get a good chow fun, noodle, rice flat noodle, or even Fu Ki, which I think is still fairly decent for wonton noodle soup. But I think it would be nice if we could have more, even one good grocery store, because the people at Wallach House, they have to depend on a bus to take them to the suburbs to buy Chinese groceries, or their parents or someone would have to pick them up to take them to buy Chinese goods. But I guess the city's trying hard. There's in the summer, there's a food tent outside that sells fresh produce. And so they're trying their best by including Chinese vegetables. So it's not too bad. So they're trying that way. But yes, it's not quite the same as it was before, but it's still there, and there's still people living there. There are still children there, and I think it would be great if we could have more programs like that. If there was a park where people could play and gather together. And the church does try to provide that, but maybe it's not the same without having a bigger space for that.
You know, also just to add again some other perspectives, the church itself is almost 90 years old, right? But it wasn't,
right.
The original church was on close to K Street, right? Where L or something this way.
Right.
And there. So that is still significant. It actually looks, architecturally, I think it looks very nice. But the current church where we're located at on the I and Fifth Street is very, very interesting itself. Historically, it was one of the original churches designed in the Lafon plan, the original plans, right? And then it was built over and then masked over with the sort of the look, the so-called modern look, with all the cement and stuff that covered all the original brick, and eventually took down the steeple. Eventually, it was originally a church, became an African-American church, and it was a synagogue. It was a synagogue for a little while, and then it returned back to a church. And then when Shirley and Walter and the church decided to move back over to this corner because they were redeveloping other place, they got a deal they couldn't pass down. They decided to take off the added coating on the church. Didn't know exactly what would be underneath it, but they found the original brick, and they're able to reproduce the steeple as it was originally designed. I think it's quite, and they redid the interior and the sanctuary area is beautiful. You can still see the stained glass where the Star of David was, but it's now been changed a little bit, but it still functions as the church still functions as a sort of a carryover place or for the 6th and I Street. When they have the high holidays, there's still a relationship to that church. So that's pretty interesting in terms of the historical Chinatown or the history of the Chinatown area. There's a lot of interesting things there, aside from the fact that people are moving out or people are trying to buy groceries from some other place. There are also still, I made the mistake one day giving a talk, and I was saying that the best restaurants are in Rockville. I got criticized heavily for that, so Shirley, be careful. But the other thing is that Shirley mentioned the China Boy. That's another very important historical significant community place. I think Jack and everybody talked about. I was just there the other day and bought my usual chow fun and delicious. Shirley, you tell the story, the wonderful story of how they bought the first rice noodle machine, right? You tell that story very well. You should tell them that story.
A family friend of my mother's came to DC. She noticed that there was no hao fun to buy again to buy this. So she says, why not?
Is a rice noodle. It's a noodle made from rice. Yeah.
Rice is made from rice. Yes. So then she had to order the machines. I think a lot of it came from Hong Kong, maybe New York, and she set up shop there. And of course, she did extremely well. So a lot of the rice noodle is being, she sells to not only as that little takeout place in China Boy, but she sells it to restaurants and the shops all around the DC area. But then, as it turned out, like a lot of things in Chinatown businesses, children don't want to do this. So her kids didn't want to do this. So, but luckily now it's still being owned by a couple, a very nice couple, and they have taken it over and they are continuing the business. And I'm glad they're doing well.
But you know, Shirley,
Mhm.
Shirley, the recently you can't
Mhm.
tell because COVID shut everything down, but they renovated the entire inside
Yes.
of the restaurant. So it has a
Oh.
very nice eating space that
Mhm.
we don't, no one has used yet because of COVID.
Yeah.
But the yeah, go ahead.
Well, they had planned on doing this before COVID.
Mhm.
And then I wasn't sure they were going to continue, but apparently they were able to do it anyway. But I think you can still go in there and get carryout, but not sit there. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yes.
you can order straight from the door.
Right.
But
Oh,
I
okay.
ordered yesterday, got great stuff.
Oh,
But
lucky you.
they
Oh.
still delivered they still have two trucks that deliver the Hefan
Mhm.
to the area Chinatown area Chinese restaurants.
Oh.
So I think it's pretty important to also
Mhm.
point out that at one point, and this is something Jack might want to talk about too, because in the China Alley area behind Tony Chan's, it used to be a place where they grew bean sprouts. And bean sprouts actually supplied the
Mhm.
entire Chinatown Chinese restaurant industry in the DMV actually. And there was the Toon Lee's father was the bean sprout king. That's what everybody thought. Jack, you should tell the stories about growing up. You and Penny dating maybe in the in front of the shop and that sort of stuff.
Actually, that's a good point about the businesses. Most people knew about the restaurant businesses, but there were probably at least two bean sprout factories, I call them. And if you've never seen one, it's pretty interesting. The folks, especially Mr. Lee, who was a cousin of mine's, they had this like 8 by 10 rolls of just trash cans with holes punched on the bottom. There was a hose that ran around and they would just water them. I'm not sure where the water ran to because I was so young back then. And then when he moved from the row house that he had it in, he moved it into that big warehouse that you see back in the alley. And then he could really expand the size of his business. But the other thing, and I can't remember if he did it, but there was another business where people made the tofu or, bean curd as it's known. So, I mean, that was some of the back businesses, usually in the alleys, and they did deliver, because most people knew about the restaurants, but these places, weren't very well known except to probably most of the local Chinese businesses.
These are great stories. I love them all. And everyone should now go to China Boy too. It's on 6th Street off of H. I want to touch on the concept of Chinatown being a cultural touchstone. This has sort of come up in conversations before. Why is it important to have a cultural touchstone? Especially as generations sort of proceed, right? So you all have deep connections to Chinatown, but maybe your kids don't have that much of a connection. Is it important, and why?
As an
And I'll stop.
American-born Chinese, it's very important now. When I was younger, I wish I had paid more attention to, my parents, the culture, and everything. But I was just too young and dumb to understand it. But now I wish that I spoke the language better. I wish my kids spoke the language better. And so, as part of Chinese Youth Club, they at least do the lion dance, which is, a very linked to martial arts in a sense, but it provides them at least a link to some of the past of the, not only club but what also occurs in Chinatown. So yeah, I'm trying to catch up now.
I think one of the things everyone has to, whether it's Chinese Americans looking at their Chinese roots or Jewish Americans looking at their Jewish roots or Irish Americans going back, like Reagan goes back to see his hometown or something of this sort. Everyone has to sort of like reach back and understand that aspect of them, because it is part of them. You don't have to, you can live in isolation, don't worry about it. But if you want to think about it, where did your parents come from, and how does their culture affect us, and how am I going to affect my children? Those things are important for your own self. And then if you can, from that, develop a sense of a community, that community gives you strength as well. So you know that you're not just an isolated person, that you do have a rich culture that goes back, which incidentally, in the American case, I think that for Shirley and Jack and myself, when we grew up, it's not as it is today, where everyone celebrates diversity and multiculturalism. I can remember very much, or my father telling me that teachers would come to his place of work where my dad worked. He was a butcher, and guys would go, and for Chinese, it's a big deal when a teacher comes to talk to them, and they would say to him, "Look, Mr. Gong, you got these 7 kids that are trying to grow up in the United States. I think it's not good for you to speak Chinese to them." So the idea of trying to keep your language or learn something like Jack is saying was actually officially sort of told to us, don't do it, because otherwise you won't become successful in America. And then if you look at the way our melting pot policies were, it was sort of like to deny that the Chinese American history existed. So part of it is and you can't do that because one, we do eat things which nobody seems to eat. I love chicken feet, and I don't know why people don't like that, or some of the guys, this sort of stuff. And having a place or knowing the stories is important, but the stories themselves if the place where these stories were made, i.e. Chinatown, disappears or is gone, there's nothing that really reinforces it, except maybe nowadays there's a recognition that there's an acknowledgement that there is some kind of Chinese culture or other people's culture, Hispanic culture, that you should recognize. But if you don't, it is not the same as coming back and having it actually reinforced. If I can come back and find a place to buy a cha chu bao, or I can say something to Shirley and say, hey, let's go get some chao fan, and let's get some hami chao fan. You would know exactly what I'm talking about. And we would sit there and enjoy it and get the Chinese juk and then put 1,000-year-old egg in it, and we love it, right?
Right.
But so those things are all important for us to reinforce who we are. And I think it reinforces our community. And that is important, I think, to have. If you have to have a place. If the place is no longer being maintained because the people who are part of that culture are leaving or gone or something like this, you still maybe preserve the places so that they become that cultural, that touchstone that allows us to reinforce our culture. If I can get my kids to come over and do it, then that's great. But the other thing is, I just feel comfortable maybe walking around Chinatown. That's good for me. So I think that's important. Shirley, what do you think?
Oh yes, of course. I think especially for our children, like you say, for the younger generation, to understand and appreciate maybe not so much what we did, maybe what our parents had to go through. Mm-hmm. And now that I'm working with the new immigrants, sometimes they think that we have a lot easier because a lot of our college educated, we live in a house and they may live in a smaller place and they seem like they have to struggle so hard. So I like to tell them it wasn't always that way, that we also had a little more difficult time. And then when we lived in DC, there weren't that many Asian people or even Chinese people here at all. So you were a minority. And then our parents didn't speak proficient English. So I got to be able to use the American dictionary really well, looking up words for everybody. And now no one uses a dictionary, but still it was really good. And then, I would bring home notes from the teachers. And they couldn't quite understand it. So I would have to explain, you know, the teacher wants me to read more or something. They said, oh, you know, they didn't understand this. Or they want you to come to the school. And they definitely did not want to take the time to do this. So then I would have to go and explain, no, they can't take off. You know, this is just impossible. You know, they just don't do things like that. So I was like the go-between. Okay, I'll write another note and send it to you so your parents could read it. And then I would have to explain to them what the note said, actually. So I'd like to tell the new immigrants, it's not that easy, wasn't that easy for us either, even though they're going through a tough time now, but things will get better. And they just have to keep on studying and they keep on working, and somehow they'll get through this, and they will have better jobs than their parents, and they will live in a house someday. But I'm glad that, I think though, like Ted and Jack, we do need to remember our stories, our past, and we need to pass them on to the younger generations, our children.
Thank you, Shirley. Jack, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I find it interesting because, and it's great what Shirley's organization does.
After a while, I know it's easy.
I'm sorry, can you hear me? Oh, okay. I mean, it's great that there are actual organizations that do, you know, help the immigrants. You know, back in the early days of Chinatown, really, it was all done by family associations mostly. And as part of the Lee family, my father kind of was like an unofficial social worker. You know, he didn't get paid for it, but, you know, he did a lot of the translations. He would help people get their, you know, green card, social security card, and things like that. You know, even today, I have folks come up to me and say, you know, your father helped me do such and such or do such and such, and you know, I wish there was a way to document it, but there really isn't, because, you know, everything was done face to face. You know, when people came to our house, you know, that's what they came for. You know, he would help them write, or, you know, help them get what they needed done. So to have an organization like, you know, Chinese Community Church is, you know, really great news to hear.
Thank you.
It's interesting. Jack talks about family associations and so forth, and I kind of look at the chat and see sometimes there's a couple of questions about different things, and people talk about the disappearance of Chinatown every 5 years. There's almost more frequently now. There's an article that talks about Chinatown, DC disappearing, and then we talked about 90 years of history with the Chinatown Church and the CYC, and people coming back to keep it as a sort of a cultural touchstone of sort. But there are 30 family associations underneath the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. And that includes the Lee Family Association, one of the strongest ones that Jack belongs to. And there are others. On Leong Association is still a very strong one. And there are quote unquote other rival groups, but there are 30 of these things around different places. And they're not leaving China. There's a commitment among them to stay in Chinatown. So as you see the disappearance of restaurants and those outward expressions of Chinatown that people see, the other parts of Chinatown are still there. I don't know if even just in terms of I don't know. You know, nowadays the CYC line dance is one of the few that is still strongly culturally. Chinese culture is one of its main objectives, but there are other line dances. Like another strong one is Raymond Wong's Wong people, and they're more diverse. And I don't know if Jack, you could talk about how the line dances have competed or how they see each other. How in the old days it was really were rivals, and you had to demonstrate your skills much more. Before. I don't know how's that going for you now? I would say that Raymond talks about CYC and the other people that have these colorful lions. They're like the pink lions and aqua colored lions, and he says these are not the standard lions, which should be black and red, and only those colors. These other ones are Hello Kitty lion dancing, and the Raymond people are the real lion. What about that? How can you talk about the tradition? So as we are using these things to remind ourselves of our traditions, and so how much of it is changing, or how do you see the rivals? How do you see the different lion dancing teams in Washington that are Raymond's lion dance is mostly almost African Americans, right? Something of this sort.
Well, actually, for CYC, I'd like to make a note that the reason the lion dance started was really to support the war effort against Japan. The founding members of CYC took a trip up to New York City to borrow a lion head so they could come down here and do the lion dance, do all the blessings that we would normally do to support the war effort against Japan. As for today's groups, I think there's a mutual respect, if you ever come to the Chinese New Year's parade, you will see that the groups are lined up by origin or age. So because we're founded in 1939, we are usually the first lion dance group. I think Raymond's is second, and then it falls in order from there. As far as CYC is concerned, we get along with everybody. We don't have, we're not a traditional Kung Fu school, I guess is what I should say. We do the lion dance, and we've had, Kung Fu lessons before and delved into other things, but we're not like a traditional Kung Fu school like Wong's and maybe some of the other organizations. But for the most part, if you are, for some reason, a rogue school or don't act politely in the parade, then you're just not invited and you won't be part of it the following year.
What are the age groups now? I noticed that I like the CYC guys a lot because you have these really small lion dance people. And how are you feel like there's a flow through of young people still interested? Also, you have very strong women contingent now in what used to be almost all men, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, CYC really fosters through family growth and, bringing up, my sons, and then hopefully theirs, their daughters, sons and daughters, when that time comes. The CYC is a very strong family-oriented organization. It's not to say you can't be, you have to. It's just part of it, And I think even, those kids who are not my sons and daughters, I'm their uncle. I treat them as sons and daughters for the most part. I would do whatever I can to help them, not just with lion dance, but with any other part of life. I think it's just, part of just, being a Chinatown resident, part of an organization. And I would include Chinese church because I did go there. I probably wasn't a very good student. Sorry, Shirley. But, all those organizations were part of Chinatown, and I always will feel part of it.
Thank you all so much. We are rapidly going through our session time today. These stories we could speak all evening about. I did want to get the audience an opportunity to ask some questions too. I see a few in the queue, so I'm going to hand it over to Gabby to see what questions for the panelists we have.
Awesome. Yeah, we have some really great questions up in the queue. The first one is from Ryan Tony. He asks, what are some ways that non-native Washingtonians or other outsiders can support DC Chinatown? Where are good places to spend our money and organizations to support? I think you touched on a great answer to this question already, of course, especially in neighborhoods like this where a lot of the business is based off like cultural goods or objects or food, like you vote with your dollar. So spending money in Chinatown at all is a great orientation to have. But I'm wondering if our panelists have any idea of answers to this question.
They can always go to our website and donate to the 82 Foundation.
That's true. We also have a website, the Chinatown Service Center. We also welcome volunteers. You don't have to be Chinese. You don't even have to speak Chinese. We always need help. Right now, we just started our Zoom English classes, citizenship classes. So I think if we have more people, we could keep the classes smaller, maybe 1 to 2 instead of having a big group of 10. I think that would work even better.
Awesome, thanks so much. Another attendant asked, what were some underlying reasons for Chinatown being located in the 6th Street Northwest area rather than F Street Southwest, Georgetown, or areas in the downtown or uptown areas of DC at the time of establishing a location? Funnily enough, actually, I can answer this question a little bit before we go into the panelists. With the 1882 Foundation, I worked on a walking tour of the neighborhood, so have, I think, like an okay knowledge of its background and history. So Chinatown actually, when it was first established, was located between, I believe, 4.5 and 2nd Street, right underneath Pennsylvania Avenue. But that area today, as you know, is the location of Federal Triangle. So when the Federal Triangle project started, they actually displaced that entire neighborhood, and the community was forced to move to its current location, which was available because at the time it was a relatively underdeveloped neighborhood. There was a lot of real estate there that was available, and that was actually all adjudicated by family associations and merchant associations, like Jack and Ted have mentioned throughout this panel. Yeah. We have another question asking from Nady. Hi, Nady. How do you convince young people that their culture is important? I know many people who go to Chinese school merely because their parents tell them to.
For me, I never went to Chinese school because my first language is actually Spanish, because I was around great agricultural workers and itinerant workers and so forth like this. I don't know what the answer is to that. I think that at some point, each family, each individual is going to have to make their choices. And what we can do as adults who want to teach to their kids or to convey that history to them is make things available for them. So we have our Cultural Talk Stories, we have our Chinatown Art Studio, we have the Chinatown community events, we have the picnics, we have the CYC Lion Dance, and we also have like various art contests and things of the sort that are going on. So I think we just make that available to them, and at some point, people have to make choices on what they think are important. And I think that at a certain point, they come back. I don't think we have to worry too much that they're not going to learn. We just make it available to them, show them that it's important. And then at some point when they are a little bit older, a little bit more mature, they're going to say, I'm going to come back, and like Jack, I want to take Taishan lessons. and because that's, so for us as a sort of community leaders, that's why it's important for us to have these type of events, to have the foundation, the history events, or the CYC line dancing, the other things like that. Those are important places where people can be exposed to. So every year, and I hope they continue, and I don't know if they will, we have the Chinatown picnic, the Chinatown Park, and we have the outside movies, and we have the Moon Festival. We have the Moon Festival there, which was canceled this year. We have these type of events that just reinforce or teach people that there are things that have a Chinatown distinctness about them, and you could learn about it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ted. Lily wants to know, this is a question for Jack. How might your parents have voted in DC back in the day? And Chinatown residents who became naturalized, where would that have happened?
Well, I'm going to take a wild guess here because Chinese back in the 60s and 70s were mostly Republicans. In fact, our neighbor 2 doors down actually ran for mayor, I think. Or was it mayor or Congress? Dr. William Chin Lee. He was probably one of the first Chinese Americans that I know of that actually ran for a public office. So my guess would have been Republican, just because I think that was the majority at that time. I don't know about Democrats, so I would say Republican.
Yeah, I think that's true. That was Dr. Chin Lee, who ran for mayor. He didn't win, but anyway, he did try.
Well, in the most recent elections, local elections, we have two young 30-ish type people. I was just saying anybody under 50, I think is young. So Yilen Zhang ran for Ward 2 representative. And in the current election, there's Alistair John, who is running for school board. So there are people involved. I don't know what political affiliations they have, but they're involved. And you certainly have a lot more opportunities now. Probably in the 60s, where I grew up in California, March Fong Yu ran for Secretary of State in the 50s and 60s, and it was one of the first sort of statewide elected Chinese Americans. So that happens. As far as naturalization, I guess in the old days you had to naturalize by a court. You had to pass the test through immigrate INS at that time, and then you were naturalized in a court. Nowadays it's done by the immigration office, not a court function anymore.
Thank you guys for that story. That was really interesting. Sam says, thank you for the wonderful stories. How can local museums in DC help to preserve and document the history of DC's Chinatown?
So one of the great things that is happening is this Smithsonian has done a great job, especially the Anacostia Community Museum. Most recently, they had put up an exhibit called The Right to the City, which sort of like featured the neighborhoods within Washington, D.C. As everyone knows, Washington is not a downtown, uptown place. It's based on your different neighborhoods. And so I think one of the good things about the Anacostia Museum is that they created an exhibit that featured each of the neighborhoods. And one of the neighborhoods was Chinatown. Last year, other museums and other places have done a lot of things. So last year was the 150th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, other people, Postal Service featured stories about Chinese history and that event and about Chinese history in general. So one of the things we need to do is just to make sure that they're aware of these events to produce exhibits and programs within our own area. I think that, for example, we ourselves will continue to build our sort of programs, and we're working with the Jewish Historical Society, trying to do joint walking tours. I think Gabby and a couple of other people are trying to do that, because Chinatown, if we're talking about place, the place in Chinatown is as important historically to the Jewish German community as it is to the Chinese community. And the idea of doing something jointly to celebrate that or memorialize that relationship to place, I think is important. I think that if the Martin Luther King Library is going to open again very soon, and in the renovated process there, I think they could do things like, they work closely with us now on things like the Chinatown Park or outreach things. They participate in our Chinatown parades now. And I think that they could do other things that the city could help out too, in the sense that fund a place in the Martin Luther King that celebrates Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream idea and create a Chinese American reading room or things of this sort. These are all things that are possible. It's just for us to just imagine and figure out how we can work together and be aware of one another.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for those answers. I'm going to hand it back. Oh, okay. It sounds like we have one more question. Elizabeth is wondering if there are many ways to push back against gentrification in Chinatown, or do you think there are other effective ways to reclaim Chinese culture in DC?
That's hard. I don't know, because developers have come in. Chinatown's a hot area to live. You know, we have all these high-end stores, city center, these really teeny tiny apartments going for a lot of money. I don't know. It's difficult to have affordable housing just for regular people who don't make very much money to live here. I think that's the hard part. I don't know if anything can change that really.
I think one of the important things is to try to save Museum Square. I don't know what is happening there, but if you lose Museum Square, just like when the first convention center was built and kind of demolished half of Chinatown, if you keep chipping away, eventually the people have to go somewhere else. And if the city is not going to do anything to, I don't want to say designate an area, but create an atmosphere for Chinese to live in, then it's all going to go probably in the next 5 years, be my guess.
In the last 5 years, 10 years, the development all around us, with all the glass buildings, with and so forth, that is just Mount Vernon, and then the huge building next to all this, like grass growing all around. But I don't know if opposing gentrification is the issue, is the solution, because I don't know if it's possible. The idea is to figure out how that growth is happening. Then how do we make sure that our cultural perspectives or other things that can allow us to retain some aspect of Chinatown is kept? And so the city plan itself already has things like Chinatown should be a distinct cultural destination, as is that whole area. So we should look at this, make the city, hold the city accountable to its small area development plans, and then say, okay, how are you manifesting this in the sense of preventing developers from just sort of overwhelming the whole thing? How do you get the developers to integrate within their building, within their designs and so forth, things that feature what is important to the community or the community around, the Chinese community around here that sees Chinatown as important. And that's why the Love Letter project, which Jen is doing, is so important. Because what it is it's reaching out to people to say, tell me what is important about this community that we should somehow highlight. So that if a developer comes in, there's a sense that the 3 shops on Chinatown off H is actually sacred space. Sacred, not in the sense of, in the sense that it is important culturally for us. And so you can't just say these are insignificant buildings. So part of what we can do is sort of highlight or raise these places and raise their platform so that they're aware of it, so that the developer can't just come in, or somebody else can't come in, or the city just says, I didn't know that. I didn't know that there was a historical significance to that corner. I remember talking with the Jewish historians, and they were talking about the city has just taken out these things that used to be part of where the horses used to hook their buggies and things like that. And it's just, who would have known, like this? And so the highway department just comes over and runs over the place, right? The other thing is that the city should be aware that it's just not just the mom and pop shops that look Chinese and that are just fusion shops. One of the things that I think that has really quote unquote degentrified China, or made Chinatown so much less a Chinatown, is that the loss of large banquet facilities. So if you think about it, a banquet place is so important for anybody's culture, but particularly for the Chinese culture. This is the place where you celebrate the most important things in your life's transitions: the weddings, the funerals, or you remember your important family people, the birth of a son, which is a big banquet event, and so forth. If you don't have those banquet places, you go somewhere else, and the place you go is someplace like in Rockville or other places where there is a parking lot, right? And so some of the city plans, where they say that we're going to eliminate or limit people from coming into the city because we believe in less traffic coming in, is actually counterproductive to the maintaining of the Chinatown in that sense, or the cultural aspects of Chinatown. And it's not just Chinese. If you eliminate parking spaces for the Black historic churches, and the people who have tried to go there for the weekend don't have places to park, then eventually those churches are going to move out to where the people are, right? So the city can do a better job if they try to figure out how do we integrate this things that you wouldn't even think of are affecting culture, such as a bicycle trail, a track that eliminates all the street parking in front of a restaurant. That makes a difference.
And thanks all. We've ran out of time. It's 6:30. So I just want to say thank you for all of the great questions. I know this conversation can continue to go on, and there'll be other opportunities too to have more conversations about Chinatown. So with that, thank you, Gabby, also for facilitating. I wanted to just quickly just wrap up to thank all of the event contributors today. Our panelists, Ted, Shirley, and Jack, you are all just a wealth of knowledge, and it's so great to be able to hear all of your stories and experiences for us to be able to learn and share to others as well. So Gabby, thank you for your moderation. Jan and Catherine, thank you so much for your ASL interpretation today. That has been great. And Sarah, who is our graphic recorder today, we will be sending her illustration as a gift to you all for your attendance to capture today's conversation takeaways. And thank you to the behind the scenes for Jelani for recording today's session and making this available on YouTube after we close. I also invite you all to take part in our post-event survey. So on the next slide, if you could capture this, we'll put it in the chat, and we'll also follow up an email. It would be great to hear from you in order to capture sort of like what we should, how we could bring more content like this to you all, and how we could also improve. So again, we appreciate everyone's time. As you leave, we never really got to it, but if anyone wanted to sort of share some notes about what makes, what they love about their own neighborhood, we'd love to hear from all of you too. And we'll also save that chat and try to incorporate it in our final event notes. If you had an opportunity to write a little love letter for your own community. So with that, we will sign off. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen.